this is part two of Revolution and the Cold War, Guatemala 1954. And part one ended with Arbenz in power and moving forward with the agrarian reform. It began in June of 1952. It took a little bit of time because he created agrarian reform committees and so forth. And it was a very modest, very capitalist-oriented reform. And the basic outlines of it are right here on the slide. The government could expropriate uncultivated land on plantations that were considered large, in other words, more than 220 acres. Now, they could only do that if less than 2/3 of the land was in cultivation. In other words, if you had a massive estate and you weren't growing anything on it, then you could have it expropriated. But it wasn't just taken. The government paid the full value of the lands with Guatemalan government bonds. Now, that's the one, thing they'd say, well, it's, how valuable are those bonds? Well, how valuable was the land? And they said, we're going to pay you exactly what you say your land is worth. We're going to look at your tax return, and whatever you declared it's worth, we'll pay you. The agrarian reform lasted 18 months and was incredibly successful. 1.5 million acres were redistributed with more than 100,000 families benefiting. And these are Central American peasant families. We're talking about, 5 to 8 people per family. So that's, a little under a million people directly benefiting. And if it were going to be anything like Mexico's agrarian reform, a lot of other people indirectly benefiting. But the opposition was virulent. Immediately, not only conservative Guatemalans, but people in the United States who didn't approve of this sort of thing claimed that Arbenz was not just a communist, but that he was working closely with Moscow. There were articles in the American press that said that there were secret Soviet military installations in Guatemala. Of course, none of that was true. Now, the main target of this was the largest single landowner, which was the United Fruit Company. And in all of its many, many acres, over 573,000 acres of its lands were not being cultivated. 85% of its total land lay fallow. And United Fruit Company said, well, we need to keep it that way in case of a natural disaster. And as soon as the agrarian reform began, they planted on it, which led to the joke that people said that an agrarian reform was a natural disaster for the United Fruit Company. Now, to be fair to United Fruit, bananas are kind of a unique crop. And every banana if you go to the supermarket, all the bananas you see are genetically identical. And what that means is that certain kinds of blight can wipe out an entire crop of bananas. And so banana companies did need to have some land that was separate in the case of a major blight, but 85% of your land separate was certainly an extreme case. Now, according to the agrarian reform, Guatemala would pay the United Fruit Company exactly what it said its land was worth. And the Guatemalan government looked at those tax returns and said, well, look, we're going to give you $627,572 in bonds. United Fruit Company said, look, this is worth almost $16 million. We think the land is worth $15,854,849. And the United States government was very, very insistent that United Fruit Company was right. And Guatemala said, look, we're going to give you $627,572. And no matter how much pressure they faced from the United States government and from United Fruit Company's lawyers, the Arbenz administration said, we're going to stick to this number. And you know why? Because this is what you said it was worth. And United Fruit Company publicly said, well, the government is lying. And so Arbenz released United Fruit Company's latest tax filings, which claimed that they were worth $627,572 and said that, look, either you're lying about the value of the land on your taxes or you're lying now. But if you want the $16 million, you have to admit that you're a tax cheat. And United Fruit Company actually admitted it had cheated on its taxes. They said, yes, of course we've been cheating on our taxes and we want our $16 million. Well, Arbenz wouldn't budge, and he stuck to that much lower number. But this incident leads the United States government to decide it's time to get rid of Arbenz. The United States government thought that the agrarian reform itself made Arbenz a communist. They said, look, if you're the kind of person who's going to go after U.S.-owned businesses, then you're a communist. And remember, this is the height of the Cold War in 1954. And because Arevalo and Arbenz were both very sincere Democrats, they had never opposed the idea of including members of the Communist Party in any government form if they were elected or appointed. And there were actual communists on some of the local councils that decided what lands could be expropriated. But to Arbenz, that was no big deal. That was democracy in action. To the United States, it was yet another symbol of the fact that Arbenz was a communist. But mostly they thought he was a communist because he went after big business. If you go after an American business, that makes you communist in the eyes of many in the Eisenhower administration. But there were other reasons the Eisenhower administration was freaked out. And this is one of those things where, the conspiracy theorists have a point. I'm not sure they're right, but they have a point. And their point is that the Eisenhower administration was incredibly closely tied to the United Fruit Company. The director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Allen Dulles, had been the president of the United Fruit Company before he went into government service. His brother was a Secretary of State, and he had been one of United Fruit Company's lead lawyers in the old white shoe law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. So one brother, the head of the CIA, used to run it. The other was their lead lawyer, the Secretary of State. The Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America, John Moores Cabot, was from an old Boston Brahmin family, and they were among the largest shareholders in the United Fruit Company. And his cousin, Henry Cabot Lodge, senator from Massachusetts, chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was also a major shareholder. So now some people look at that and they say, see, well, the Eisenhower administration was just doing the bidding of the United Fruit Company. I don't think it's that clear. I think that the close relationship between United Fruit Company and U.S. policymakers meant that U.S. policymakers were intimately aware of what was going on in Guatemala. But they were probably more motivated by this broad sense that attacking an American business in the 1950s, even if it, by Guatemalan standards and Latin American standards, it was an incredibly just criticism and attack. After all, United Fruit Company had been cheating the Guatemalan people, by lying on their taxes for years. It made them, in the eyes of the U.S. government, dangerous and radical and communistic. And so the United States decided it was time to get rid of Arbenz. And the first thing the United States did was began a trade embargo. They tried to hurt the Guatemalan economy. Then they created an army of dissidents who they were going to have move against the elected government. They were trained in Honduras, fully funded by the United States. And in 1952, the U.S. government had overthrown the democratically elected moderate reformist Mossadegh in Iran and put in the Shah to protect the oil interests of both the British and the United States. And this was very much kind of the template for this. And Iran in 52 and then Guatemala in 54, those became the template for the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 in Cuba, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture. So the United States is openly arming rebels. It's known, it's reported in the New York Times, it's known throughout the region, to overthrow Arbenz. And so Arbenz looks to buy weapons for the military, but he is facing a U.S. and U.S. ally trade embargo. So he decides to buy weapons from Czechoslovakia. And that was seen as proof that he was a communist. Now, Israel had also faced in 1948 and 49 and into the early 50s a boycott of arms. The United States was much more neutral in the Middle East then. And they had purchased arms in Czechoslovakia, and that did not make them communists. But in the eyes of many in the administration, it made Arbenz a communist. And actually testifying in front of the Senate, one member of the State Department used what he called the duck test. What he said is, of course, Arbenz claims not to be a communist. But if you ask a duck if he's a duck, he doesn't answer. But he looks like a duck, he waddles like a duck, and he sounds like a duck. And when we look at Arbenz, we think that, he waddles like a communist, he looks like a communist, and he sounds like a communist. So it's a pretty lame way of making policy, but that was literally what they thought. He had to be a communist in their eyes. And so U.S. coup plans went into high gear. And on July 18th, 1954, an ex-military man named Carlos Castillo Armas led a CIA-backed army into Guatemala to overthrow Arbenz. He only had about 150 men, but it was very well known that he was supported by the CIA. And there was very, very little popular support, but there was popular fear. And the U.S. Embassy had set up big loudspeakers on top of buildings and played recordings of bombings. And basically everyone was just terrorized that if they tried to support Arbenz, then the U.S. would invade. And so Arbenz fled the country and Castillo Armas took over. Now, this coup's success had very long-term implications in U.S. policy. As I mentioned, it becomes the template for the Bay of Pigs in 1961, but one of the key operatives in planning it was a man named E. Howard Hunt. And, he goes on not only to be involved in the Bay of Pigs, but he then is involved in the Watergate burglary. And in fact, the burglary is committed by Hunt using several Cuban refugees who are veterans of the Bay of Pigs. So it's a kind of bizarre conspiracy theory thing, that, you've got the ties to United Fruit, the ties to the Republican Party, from Iran to Guatemala to Cuba to Watergate. But more significantly, I think, for world history, what you have was the fact that a very modest attempt to transform the society is violently turned back. And when Castillo Armas took power, and he doesn't hold power for long, there are a series of military dictatorships throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s in Guatemala, he immediately canceled the political rights of the majority of the population. He turned back the clock to Ubico-style politics. He reversed the agrarian reform. People, more than 100,000 families, almost 1 million people who had their land, lost it, and it was returned to United Fruit. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture that we're starting to look at radical solutions. And this is actually a radical right-wing solution to an attempt at a democratic reform, a mild attempt of populism. And so what we see now in the Cold War is that the ouster of Arbenz was the first real tangible, real publicly obvious example of how the United States is going to operate in the Cold War period. The coup sent a very clear message to reformers that, don't challenge U.S. interests, don't go too far. It doesn't matter that you're not a communist. We reserve the right to call you one and to believe you're one and then to overthrow you. If you're too nationalistic, if you go after U.S. capital a little too vigorously, we could get rid of you. And this context explains the rise and radicalization of Fidel Castro. And in fact, Che Guevara, who we're going to talk about in the next lecture, the Argentine radical who helps Castro, is in Guatemala during the coup. He witnesses this because he was fascinated by the agrarian reform. He wanted to see what reform looked like, and he saw firsthand, how the United States reacted. But you didn't have to be there. People throughout the region knew this, and remember, this is 1954. Travel is easier. There's radio. Newspapers and newsreels are circulating, and people throughout the region now saw that a clear marker had been put down by the United States that if you went too far, didn't matter how democratic you are, you could be overthrown by the U.S. government.